I joined the Army back in 2004. And when I joined the Army, I didn't really know what I was doing, just with my life, and I needed a change in my life, and I knew the military would give me that change. So in 2004, I decided to join. Now that was one of the reasons. I have many reasons that I ended up joining. But yeah, so 2004, I joined. I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I did my basic training and my AIT. And was a cavalry scout. So Fort Knox is no longer a training area for basic, but when it did armor. So the tankers and the scouts, and then also tank mechanics and stuff like that. Went through Fort Knox, Kentucky, did 4 months of training there. Actually, at the very end of my training at Fort Knox, they started to introduce the Striker vehicle. I don't know if you ever have heard of a Striker, but they introduced the Striker vehicle, and I got to train specially on that. So I thought maybe I would go to a unit that specialized in Strikers, because there was only 8 guys in my entire basic training who went to this special training for Strikers. That didn't happen. I went to a unit that didn't have Strikers at all, and I ended up on the Bradley, which is funny because in basic training, when we trained on the Bradley, the drill sergeants told us that the nickname for the Bradley was a rolling coffin. That's not a very good nickname to have for a vehicle. And then I get to Fort Hood, Texas. That's where I ended up, and they're like, "Here is your Bradley," and I was like, "Really?" Like, I get the rolling coffin. But I knew that vehicle basically inside and out. Today, gosh, that was 2004, almost 20 years later. I couldn't tell you a whole lot about them, a lot of the things in it. But at that time, I knew that vehicle inside and out, and it was my baby, my Bradley. I started off as a driver. That's where most people start off. When you first get into the military, you either start off as a driver or a dismount, which is somebody who's just going to walk around and use your feet. So I started off as a driver. We didn't really have dismounts because we didn't have a lot of scouts, so we had too many vehicles. So there weren't too many dismounts. You had a job in the vehicles. You were either a driver, gunner, or commander. That's how that worked. So I started as a driver, and then eventually, when I was over in Iraq, because I was in Fort Hood for about a year before I ended up deploying to Iraq. And when I deployed to Iraq is when I became a gunner in the Bradley. You talk about war and you think you know about war, and you watch the movies about war. And I mean, you don't really know about war until you go there and you see it. And I can remember, because when we first got there, we went to Kuwait, which is, a safe area in general. But we drove from Kuwait to Baghdad in Iraq, and on our way up, as soon as we got over the border from Kuwait into Iraq, then it was like, everybody watch, looking out everywhere you go, outside both windows, front, back. And I can remember there was a burning tire on the side of the road, and to me, I mean, it's a war zone, things burning, and to me, it was just a burning tire. And my commander of the Humvee that day that I was riding in the back. He had been to Iraq before. He's like, "That's not just a burning tire," and that made me realize that every single thing that I saw over there, I had to pay attention to it. I had to look at it a little differently. That burning tire that I just saw as a burning tire was most likely some kind of marker for somebody else who was really far away, some enemy who was really far away, and they could see that from really far away. And there may be an IED or something buried underneath the road right there, so that when they see your vehicle go by that burning tire, they would set it off. So that's just when I learned that things aren't just the way what we think of them as, like a bag on the side of the road, not just a bag. So it was eyes open, aware every single moment of every single day when you were outside of those walls that you were protected by when you were sleeping and stuff like that. So when you left those fobs or wherever you were, patrol bases, it was locked in. So the average day, a lot of it was very similar. I mean, especially because once you get that vehicle ready in the morning or night, what time your mission is, you load into that vehicle. As a gunner, you're just looking through that sight. it's almost even hard to tell where you are truly. I mean, you know where you are before the mission because you looked at the map and you know what roads you're going on. But once you're in that turret and you're looking through that little tiny sight in front of you, you don't know where you are on that map anymore. And you know, a lot of things look the same. You know, the houses in the distance, and the canals that align the roads, like it looked very similar. So like, as a gunner, you were just looking for something that looked out of place. What is that over there? Why are those people doing what they're doing? Why are they congregating in an area that doesn't normally have people congregating, and stuff like that? So that's what you were looking for. So most days were very, very similar, and you just saw some things that just didn't fit. And that's when you would react to something like that. Hey, you'd call that in. There was one time when I was the gunner in our Bradley that we had a brand new driver. And as a brand new driver, when I say a brand new driver, I mean straight from basic training to Iraq. So he never got any extra training outside of basic. So when you're a driver of a vehicle, you are in charge of that vehicle. It is, like I said, it's your baby, and you need to know every aspect of that vehicle. If the track breaks, you need to know how to fix that. And you're not learning that in basic training. You're learning about the quick things about the vehicle, but you're not learning how to change a track. Or if you do, you learn it in a day, and you know you're not taking a ton away from that. So we were out in the middle of Iraq. I can remember we were driving through a field, which most of the times you tried to stay on the roads. The fields were um, really rough to get through, especially for Humvees and stuff. And we always had Humvees with us. But we were driving through, and we broke track. Our track broke. And, you know, as the driver, he would normally, that would be okay. Our vehicle can't move anyway. So the driver at this point can't drive. So he would get out of the vehicle and he would fix the track. Problem was, like I said, he was brand new and he'd never done this before. So I had done it many, many times. So so I actually got out of the turret and I started fixing the track. And all of a sudden, I hear gunfire. I could actually see the gunfire because it was getting dark and they had actually tracer rounds. And there was two buildings that were firing against each other. So this was Iraqi people fighting against each other, because I was over there in 2006, and in 2006 there was a big contingency of Iraqi fighters who did not like each other. Um, and they fought against each other. There was really a civil war going on at the same time that we were there fighting a war. So these people were fighting at each other, and then I saw one of our vehicles, one of our Humvees, returning fire at one of the buildings. I think maybe we knew one of the other buildings, the people that were in it. We started firing at one of the buildings, and all of a sudden you could see the tracer rounds just shift and come straight towards our vehicles. And I'm outside of the vehicle at this point, trying to fix our track because we can't move. And then one of our other Bradleys, so we usually traveled with two Bradleys. Our other Bradley parked right in front of my Bradley, so that way I was now protected. And I can remember hearing the rounds hitting their Bradley. And there I am laying on the ground with no gear on at this point, because it's really hard to change a track with your IBAS and you're trying to move around. So I had no gear on at that point, trying to change this thing. And yeah, so I never had to fire. And if I was in the turret that day while we were getting fired upon, I would have been firing back. But you know, honestly, you know, people, you know, talk about how many times they've had to fire and stuff like that. I'm glad I never had to. I am so glad that I never had to. If I was put in the situation where I needed to, I absolutely would have. But I am glad that I didn't have to, because that means I didn't have to take anybody's life either, which is easy for me to say because I didn't have to do that. So the first place that we lived in a patrol base. It was a very tiny patrol base. It was actually an old house that we had taken, and we built walls around it. And the Iraqi army lived in that same patrol base with us. So talked. I would like to say that we actually had conversations, but you know, with the language barrier, we didn't really. But we communicated with each other because we had to trust them, which was hard. You didn't know who was who and what was what. And there were times when you'd hear stuff over the radio like, hey, you know, we're being fired upon, and it's by people wearing a uniform, Iraqi army uniform. Doesn't mean they were Iraqi army, but they found uniforms and they were firing. So it was hard to know who was who. And so I didn't really have a lot of conversations with them, but we did communicate. And then there were the townspeople who, were walking by when we were out. And a lot of the times they would wave to us. And, we built relationships with some of the families because there was a couple of times or a couple of places that we were in often. Like we did some observation posts for like probably a month straight. So you saw the same people in that area for a month straight. And I can remember the kids coming up and being extremely nice to us and bringing us stuff. And so you built relationships with the people in the area. But at the same time, you didn't know who was firing at you the same day. The one vehicle that would drive by and they'd wave to you, they might be shooting at you the next day. So it was a very, very interesting area, difficult area to be in because you didn't know who you were fighting against. You didn't know who was good and bad. It was really difficult. So I made it 9 months, and I always say I almost made it. And that's a silly statement today because I did make it. But in the beginning, I used to say I almost made it, and I did make it. I'll even say that I made it out better than I went in. I'm better today than I was at that point in my life. Just what I've learned through getting through what I've gone through and all of those things. But yeah, so 9 months there, and we probably only had about a month, maybe month and a half left of like real work before we started to hand over all the areas to the next group that was coming in. So probably about another month and a half of work left before I would have stopped really going out on big missions like we did. So 9 months in, September 1st, 2006. And like I said, we got there at the very end of December of 2005. So 9 months in, I was in my Bradley fighting vehicle, and we were on a road that we had been on many times before. And this day, somebody actually buried an IED into the road. Maybe the IED was buried there for a very long time and just wasn't being used. And then, one day they decided they were going to use it. So we were driving, and the IED that was in that road was detonated underneath my vehicle and went up into the turret where I was sitting. And in the turret of the Bradley is also where we have our fuel tank. So it hit the fuel tank, and as soon as that happened, I was on fire. And when I was on fire, the first thing and only thing I could think about was getting out of the vehicle. Like I couldn't think of anything else. I had to escape. So I got out, and thankfully that day I left the hatch above me open. I'm pretty sure I left the hatch above me open because my buddy Montes, who was the commander, so I was the gunner that day. My buddy Montes, who was the commander, had left his hatch open. So usually we keep our hatches closed in case we ever get hit with chemicals or something like that. And if we were in a actual battle situation, we would be having all the hatches closed. But we weren't. So he had his hatch open. I left my hatch open. And thankfully I did, because if I hadn't, there's no way I would have gotten out with the smoke and the fire, finding that little lever above my head. It probably wouldn't have happened. So thankfully I left it open. So I climbed to the top. Once I got to the top, I jumped off. And when I jumped, it was 10 feet from the top of the turret to the ground. It's a long ways when you're blind, because that's what was happening to me at that moment. The fire was on my face, covering my eyes. So when I landed, I couldn't land safely because I couldn't see the ground. And when I landed, I broke my leg. So I ended up severing an artery in my leg, which ended up in an amputation of my leg below my knee. So my right leg below my knee. Now, today, I use a prosthetic leg. And then I'm on the ground rolling around trying to put the fire out. Couldn't put the fire out. Gave up for a second, but only for a second, thankfully, because I ended up rolling in one direction. I just kept rolling in one direction, and I actually fell into one of the canals that I was talking about. And the canal had just enough water in it to put the fire out, and it saved my life. It saved my life. Almost killed me too, because the canals over there, some of the canals were extremely filthy, and this was one of them, and I ended up getting extremely sick because of it. But it doesn't matter. It saved my life. Yes, it almost took my life, but if it wasn't there, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. So eventually a couple of my friends found me in the canal, carried me out, and the helicopters came and took myself and my two buddies who were in the vehicle with me that day, because there was three of us in the vehicle. But the helicopter ride was the last time I saw or talked to my buddy Sergeant Luis Montes ever again. So he actually did not make it through the incident. He made it into the hospital in San Antonio, but 7 days later he ended up passing away. So, I think about him every single day. And then my buddy Lowe, he was our driver that day. I would tell you that he's doing well today, living in Arkansas, and a family, and doing well. So yeah, but I think about Montez every single day, and I think about the incident every single day. So I think about Lowe every single day too. But yeah, that day's not disappearing from my life. There's no way it can. I look in the mirror and I can't lie to myself and say this happened some other way. So I know it happened, but today I look at it as something different. Um, I have to find good things that come out of negative things that have happened in my life. I've learned that, because if I don't, then that day is nothing but negative in my life. And I tell you today that I see it as something positive in my life. Doesn't mean I wanted it to happen. It doesn't mean I'm glad it happened, but it happened, and I can't change that. And now I see that I wouldn't have met my wife if I didn't get injured in Iraq. I wouldn't have talked to almost 2 million students across the country if I didn't get injured in Iraq. I wouldn't have my 2 daughters if I didn't get injured in Iraq. So, no, I didn't want it to happen, but I can't change that it did. So now I find the amazing things that came from it. And like I said, I think about Montez every single day. So that's certainly not easy. But I can't change that, Montez passed away. I can't change that Lowe and myself were injured. But I can change how I look at that day, and I choose to find really amazing things that came out of it as well. So, changed my life. Absolutely, obviously, you can see it right here. Um, but it changed my life in a very, very positive way, or at least I chose to make it that way.